so much. Delighted to be here, part of the film festival. Although I'm here to talk to you about my book. This is the middle point of a huge book tour. I've been going all over the country and have just sort of come to roost in New York for 3 or 4 days. And the powers that be at the festival thought a perfect time to show Buckaroo Banzai, have a little mini reunion of me and Peter Weller, to do a Q&A later tonight, and to do this, to just have me talk about the book and do a book signing. In the last couple of weeks, I've talked to audiences ranging from about 100 to 1,700. So this is nice and modest. This is a great relief, and I'm delighted you're all here. I thought what I would do is, since we've sort of designated a whole hour, I'll just talk a little bit about the book and read to you from the book, get you interested in the book. But while I talk, why don't you go ahead and think about questions that you want to ask me about anything, certainly about movies. I presume you're all movie fans, since this is a sort of movie-centric week, 2 weeks here. But as you will see, I will be talking a lot about theater, about acting in general, and about storytelling. The book is called Drama, An Actor's Education, and it's exactly that. Let me tell you a little bit about the genesis of this book. It never occurred to me to write a memoir until about 3.5, 4 years ago. I didn't. The idea has come up from time to time. A couple of people have proposed ghost-writing a memoir or writing an authorized biography, and the whole notion kind of embarrassed me. I didn't think I was quite book-worthy. But something happened in the summer of 2002, a kind of inciting incident that led to this. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about this. It's more or less the preface of the book, because it sort of explains how the book came into existence. It was a time when my father was 86 years old. For the first time in his life, he was having some serious medical problems. He'd had an operation, serious abdominal surgery, and it had plunged him into a deep, deep depression. He was struggling to recover anyway, but the worst of it was he'd lost his spirit, and he'd lost his will to live. This was very unusual for him. He was a very genial man with a sly sense of humor and a big boisterous laugh, and he was a man of the theater. He was used to sort of kind of extravagant fun behavior. He generated it in other people too. But this was a different Arthur Lithgow. He was just wasting away. And I found myself taking care of him and my mother for a whole month, just to arrange for some kind of home care for them. But mainly I realized as soon as I saw him that my job was to cheer him up. That if he didn't simply cheer up, he was not going to survive this. And everything I tried failed. That was how deep this depression was. And then I hit on the idea of telling him bedtime stories, reading them to him. I searched his bookcases. Boy, can we get that a little quieter up there? I feel like I'm an actor. I can't stand people not paying attention to me. Can we even close that space? It's bedlam. Anyway, I searched through the bookcases in their little condo in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I found this book called Tellers of Tales, which my father had used to read stories to me and my siblings when we were little kids. And that evening, when my mom and dad were all tucked in, I surprised them. I showed them this book, and I told them to pick a story. And they picked a story called Uncle Fred Flits By P.G. Wodehouse. I recognized the title immediately, although I had over the years, I'd pretty much forgotten the story. It was our favorite story when we were kids because it was so damn funny. And they picked it, so I read it, and it almost exploded in my hands. It was so hilarious. It was this masterpiece of humor. And the more I read, the more of it came back to me after 55 years. And the characters revealed themselves, and the complications kicked in, and one by one, I recognized all these things that we thought were so damn funny all those years ago. And then it happened. My father started to laugh. The more I read, the harder he laughed. It's this kind of gurgly, helpless laugh, almost in spite of himself. It was like the engine of an old car starting up after years of disuse. And I can't help thinking that it was sometime during the reading of that story that he came back to life. I mean, the next day he started to rally, and his high spirits and his health started to come back. And he lived another year and a half, much longer than any of us had dared to hope. And that moment became a kind of epiphany for me. Long after he had passed away, it sort of percolated in my mind, and it began to sort of crystallize all my feelings about what I did for a living. Let me read you the last part of the preface as a sort of follow-up to this story, as the first thing that I read. Just pretend it's completely silent in here. Acting is nothing more than storytelling. An actor usually performs for a crowd, whether for 100 people in an off-Broadway theater or for millions of moviegoers all over the globe. Reading to my parents on that autumn evening in Amherst was something else again. It was acting in its simplest, purest, most rarefied form. My father was listening to Uncle Fred flitz by as if his life depended on it. And indeed it did. The story was not just diverting him, it was easing his pain, dissolving his fear, and leading him back from the brink of death. It was rejuvenating his atrophied soul. Lying next to him, my mother could sense that by some mysterious force, her husband was returning to her. Before he went to sleep, Dad thanked me for the story as if I'd given him a treasured gift. But he'd given me a gift, too. It was the gift of a father's love. I was 56 years old and had known him all my life. In all those years, our relationship had changed kaleidoscopically. We had been up and down, happy and sad, close and distant. Our fortunes had risen and fallen, ebbed and flowed, rarely at the same time. But in all those years, I'd never felt as close to him, nor ever felt as much love for him as I did that night. He had given me another gift, too, although he never lived to see it bear fruit. The period I spent with my parents was one of the most significant in my life. In that memorable month, that Woodhouse story was the most memorable hour. I'd spent my entire life acting in plays, movies, and television shows. I had told stories. I'd had a gratifying, fun, and prosperous career. Only infrequently had I paused to plumb the mysteries of my peculiar occupation. That night, however, everything came into focus. Sitting at my parents' bedside and reading them a story, trying to help two old people feel better, came to seem like a distillation of everything my profession is about. In the years to come, my thoughts kept returning to that evening, even after my father was long gone. Finally, spurred on by the events of that night, I decided to write this book. Now, there was a kind of intermediate stage between that evening in Amherst and writing the book, and that was creating a solo show. It began to seem to me like a fabulous idea to blend the story I've just told you with this hilarious piece of writing, Uncle Fred Flits By. So that's exactly what I did. I simply set about to memorize Uncle Fred Flits By, about a 45-minute story. And then I sort of, right here, like about 50 yards to your right at the Mitzi Newhouse Theater at Lincoln Center, Andre Bishop put a ballet studio at my disposal. I invited friends, and I simply performed Uncle Fred. And it was such a success. And as much as they loved Uncle Fred, they really loved the little 5-minute introduction I gave them, recounting this story. That's what they wanted to hear more of. Now, I'd never written anything for myself to perform derived from my own life, but this was the first time, and it got such a warm reception. You know, we did it in that little theater only about 14 times, and as a result, it became the biggest little hit in town, a hot ticket, all an actor ever dreams about. And among the people that were so excited about it was HarperCollins, who came to me to write a memoir. And again, as I've said, I never thought I wanted to or was able to write a memoir, but I said yes and set off on this journey. I don't know how many of you have actually written a memoir, but it's a very daunting task. You sort of set off as if you're Columbus seeking the new world. You don't really know where you're going, especially if you're as inexperienced a writer as I am. But the more I wrote, the more it began to take shape. I began to realize that what was interesting to me about my life was the first half of it. So that's what the book is. It ends when I'm only 35 years old. And I realized that the best way to give it a theme, an overarching idea, was to describe exactly what the subtitle of the book is, An Actor's Education. All the things that have happened to me on stage, in drama school, but probably most important in my own life, that have sort of turned me into the actor I am, or the actor I was in 1980, which I pretty much stopped growing at that point and proceeded to all the sort of far more well-known, famous, and infamous events of the rest of my life. So that became the sort of structure of the book. And of course, there were two very strong themes that I could always write toward. One of them is the story of my father's life. In a sense, it's a dual biography. It's about me and my dad and my family, and about his extraordinary role in the development of American regional theater. He was a producer of classical repertory, mainly Shakespeare festivals out in Ohio while I was growing up. And going into his business made for an extremely complex relationship between the two of us, a very close and loving relationship, but sometimes quite a difficult one. He was the first person to hire me professionally, and after a year of working with him, I definitely decided it was time to strike out on my own and proceed to New York, enter the marketplace, live the hard life of a young unemployed actor without his nepotistic protection. That makes for pretty interesting stuff, too. I hope you get and read the book and you find it vivid. Having described to you the genesis of it, you can see that the second theme I mentioned, storytelling, is a very important element. In a way, it was stories that brought my father back to life. It's stories that, in a way, define my occupation. I see myself as a storyteller as much as an actor. I almost feel that acting is storytelling, as I've just said. So I structured my book as vivid stories, just anecdotes. And that makes for a pretty good entertainment for occasions like this, to simply tell a couple of these stories. I've picked two of them, which are pretty readable and listenable to, and I think will give you a very good sense of what the book is like. The first one, if I can find it. I don't know why I always have such trouble finding this. After all, my life is chronological. It should fit right in. Here it is. It's chapter 9, and it's called Curtains. It's quieted down a little in the lobby. If anybody's talking up there, ask them if they want to hear a story. I was a curtain puller for Marcel Marceau. For decades, the immortal French mime was a yearly, one-night-only fixture at McCarter Theatre, presenting his delicate art. Any solution to that problem? If it ain't the lobby, it's the feedback. Not an easy room. Shall I start again? I can give you a little intro now, which I forgot to do. This is when I was in high school. I lived in 8 or 9 different places growing up because of my father's crazy gypsy-like ways. Our family was a kind of gypsy wagon of theatricals. But 2 of those years were in Princeton, New Jersey, when he was working at the McCarter Theatre as its director. And I was a high school kid and sort of hanging around. That's all the introduction you need. Shall I start entirely again, or perhaps you've forgotten the first sentence? I was a curtain puller for Marcel Marceau. For decades, the immortal French mime was a yearly, one-night-only fixture at McCarter Theatre, presenting his delicate art. Is there any way at all to just put a sign up saying we want some quiet? I just feel on your behalf. Are you as distracted as I am by that? Where was I? On one of his visits, I was pressed into service. I was assigned the job of raising and lowering McCarter's massive red velour curtain for Marceau's single performance. It was one of many backstage jobs that I undertook at the theater for piddling wages, but mostly for fun, during my 2 high school years in Princeton. At various times, I had run lights, painted sets, fashioned lobby displays, and operated the fly lines that hoisted flats and set pieces up and down. But pulling the curtain for the great Marcel Marceau was the best gig of all. I was humbled by the honor. In those days, Marceau was a one-of-a-kind Gallic superstar. His slight frame and unique persona recognizable everywhere. In performance, his face was painted stark white, with his mouth, eyes, and eyebrows delicately outlined in red and black. He wore white pants cut to halfway down his calves, a striped shirt, a tight, short jacket, ballet slippers, and a little blue hat with a flower sprouting out of it. In this emblematic costume, he performed a show that was simplicity itself. He would present about a dozen short mime pieces, most of them in the character of Bip, his alter ego. Marceau would chase butterflies, struggle against the wind, grow drunk at a cocktail party, or seasick on board a cruise ship, all in pantomime. The entire performance took place on an empty stage without props, sets, or supporting players. Or rather, all of those things were there, but invisible, created by the magic of Marceau's physical gifts, by the eloquent lighting, and by the imagination of the audience. Clearly, the rise and fall of the curtain was also pretty damn important. On the day of Marceau's performance, I watched worshipfully from backstage all through his afternoon technical rehearsal. Although he had been through the drill 1,000 times over the years, his preparation was exhaustive and precise. When it came time to rehearse the curtain call, his stage manager instructed me in broken English to raise and lower the curtain in a steady rhythm as Marceau took several bows. This was known as bouncing the curtain, and it required that I master a complex new skill. In the wings, I stood in front of two thick ropes. I would pull on one of the ropes to ring down the curtain while the other rope shot up in the opposite direction. When the curtain was almost down, I would grab the second rope and allow it to lift me 4 feet off the ground. At this point, my counterbalancing weight would reverse the direction of the two ropes. I would drop back down to the floor and pull on the second rope with all my might. The curtain would bounce, barely touching the stage, then gracefully rise up again. For Marcel Marceau, I was to repeat this maneuver 10 times. 5 times up and 5 times down. It was a tricky business, demanding enormous effort and split-second timing, but by the end of the tech rehearsal, I had mastered it. The evening performance was sensational. Each of the mimed mini-dramas was greeted with clamorous adulation. I and the entire McCarter crew performed our backstage tasks with self-assurance and a sure hand. Marceau had craftily saved his best material for last, and in the final moments of his performance, the audience was completely transported. I'd never heard such an ovation. Then came the curtain call. I brought the curtain down on cue. After a poetic pause, I switched ropes and pulled it back up again. I switched again, ready to bounce the curtain. The second rope hoisted me high off the ground. The curtain reversed course and came back down. I switched ropes and was hoisted back up again. The curtain bounced nicely off the stage and went straight back up. Perfection. I switched again, gaining confidence as the cheers rang out. Down, up, as Marceau smiled, clutched his heart, and grandly bowed. On the fourth bow, the curtain came down, I switched ropes, and once again I lurched back up in the air. But by this time, my strength was flagging. I lost my grip and fell in a heap onto the stage floor. I scrambled to my feet and stared at the two ropes as they gradually slowed to a stop. Terror engulfed me. I had no idea which one I should grab next. Hoping for the best, I reached for the one on the right and pulled on it for all I was worth. I pulled and pulled and pulled and pulled. Bit by bit, the rope offered less and less resistance. The roar of the crowd was oddly diminishing. A ghastly thought slowly dawned on me. Had I grabbed the wrong rope? I turned and looked out at the stage. What I saw filled me with horror. Between Marcel Marceau and the audience was a massive pile of dark red velour, about 8 feet high. It was McCarter's grand show curtain lying on the stage like an enormous felled giant. Instead of bringing the curtain back up, I brought it down, piling it up on the stage. This mountain of fabric was attached to a long metal pipe and a series of tangled wires. These hung down from McCarter's fly space in full view of the audience, slowly swaying from side to side. The crowd had fallen into a deathly silence. As for Marcel Marceau, he was standing erect with his hands on his hips, his weight on one leg, and a foot turned out. He was staring at me with stony fixity. His immobile face, with its bone-white makeup, its knit brow, and its gash-like red sneer, could only be described as a mask of rage. Predictably, the famous mime said nothing. So that's one of many, many stories in the book. Now, they finally got the good idea of closing off the lobby, just in time for the end of my story. I hope you guys have thought of some questions. Ask me about anything. There's even a microphone for you. Yes?
I was just curious, with writing a memoir, did you, thanks. With writing a memoir, I mean, did you keep a journal when you were younger? I mean, is this all from memory? How much of it was based on just what you could recall, or did you keep a diary or a journal, I guess is my question.
No, I never did keep a journal. The only time in my whole career I kept a journal was during the rehearsal period of Comedians with Mike Nichols back in the 70s, but I didn't use the journal. I also kept a sort of on-set journal for film comment back in the 80s of doing Terms of Endearment and Footloose, which I did more or less concurrently. They published that, and I got in all sorts of trouble for that. So I've always been a little cautious about going public with my journal entries. Mainly, I just used my memory, and it's amazing how much came back to me. I amazed not only myself, but everybody else, like, how did you ever remember that? Google is amazing. I mean, I was able to look up the cast of Shakespeare plays in Yellow Springs, Ohio in 1953, just to sort of prick my memory. But mainly, it is a memory piece, and you know, the thing is, it's made up of extremely formative moments in my life, and moments when I was extremely impressionable. So you do remember that. I mean, there's plenty that I've forgotten, but it was not worth remembering, apparently. So I mean, it was quite a journey to go on, to spend that much time meditating on your very, very young years. But it does come back. You would all have that experience if you haven't already. Another question? Yes? This is very nice.
Thank you for many, many hours. Thank
Yeah.
you for many, many hours of enjoyment on films,
Thank you.
TV. Probably, maybe World According to Garp, because I'm 61. That wasn't your first film, was it?
It wasn't my first, but it tends to be the first that people recall.
Breakthrough kind of thing. But I kind of think of you in Patrick Stewart in a sense. You're like the American Patrick Stewart in terms of someone who's been classically trained, and your skills shine through in every performance. And I just want to say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. There's no question mark in there?
No.
Oh, well, that's very, very flattering that you would link me to Patrick. In many ways, I feel kind of linked to Patrick. He's a friend of mine. He's one of a short list of actors. We sort of trade off roles almost. When I went to do Malvolio in London with the in Stratford with the Royal Shakespeare Company a couple of years ago, he was doing it down in Chichester. And God bless him, he came to see me in mine, you know. He's a very generous, tremendous man of the theater. And it's very interesting, the trajectory of his career. I actually mention him in the book by coincidence, so good man. He was a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company when I was going to Lambda in London in the years 67 to 69. An amazing time in London theater and in Stratford theater. The Royal Shakespeare and the National Theater were absolutely packed with actors who are now complete household names. Patrick Stewart, Judi Dench, Helen Mirren, just on and on. Anthony Hopkins in little roles, Michael Gambon, virtually a spear carrier. Derek Jacobi. They were all under 30 years old and extremely active. And I saw them in all these, you know, you go to see a season of plays at the National or at the RSC, and you're seeing the same troupe of actors each play 4 and 5 roles. So I saw Patrick as Hector in Troilus and Cressida, in which Helen Mirren was Cressida. I saw him as Grumio in The Taming of the Shrew and Touchstone in As You Like It. And then over the years, I think I first met him, I'll tell you exactly when I first met him. He was a big star in Star Trek already, but I met him at the dinner break of the Maharabata out in Los Angeles. He'd come to see his RSC friends, and we were hanging around having supper. That was the first time I ever met him. And I repeated to him what I just told you about all the times I'd seen him work. Thank you. See, that's what happens when you don't even ask a question. You get a very long-winded answer. Anybody else? Yes?
Hi, John.
Hiya.
When you were coming to your own as far as your craft, what did you feel that you struggled with personally and with trying to get into the work and learning acting?
All you have to do is read the book. It answers that. It answers that very fulsomely. The most interesting and basic answer to that is that I did not want to be an actor, which I always felt was a wonderful way to start. I wanted to be an artist, much more interested and very serious about it. I mean, I was growing up in a theater family, and I didn't want to go into the family business. Not that I was actively resisting it. It was really because from as long as I can remember, I wanted to be an artist, and I felt I had a sort of innate talent for it and facility. But there I was, it was as we were growing up as kids, and believe me, I'm telling you everything that's in the book. Maybe you don't have to read the book now. We were kids in Shakespeare plays. I played Mustard Seed, The Prince in the Tower. Literally the first line of the book proper is, the first time I acted was before I even remembered. And there's a photograph of me at age 2 in a production of The Emperor's New Clothes. That's me, this little tiny boy. That's my sister Robin, and that's my dad reaching down and holding my hand. So it was just completely what we did growing up. And by the time I was 16 and 17, I was working as an apprentice for my dad, playing all the little throwaway roles. They all seemed to be only one syllable: Nim, Pinch, Froth. I stuck around for a second season and finally was playing Hortensio and Benvolio and Guildenstern and Artemidorus. Not bigger roles, but longer names. So I was becoming an actor, whether I liked it or not, purely by osmosis. I arrived at Harvard. I mean, who knows why I went to Harvard? I basically went to Harvard because I got in, and my vanity was so flattered, I went. You don't go there if you're going to be a painter. In fact, I tell one episode of eagerly meeting Ben Shahn, the great American master, when I was trying to get into Skowhegan Art School for the summer. I was a freshman at Harvard. And he listened to me and he grilled me. He was very tough on me. Old leather-necked son of a bitch, Ben Shahn. He was like a longshoreman. And he finally said, "If you want to be an artist, what the hell are you doing at Harvard?" And he was absolutely right. It was just, I can't even name you a major painter who went to Harvard, whereas I can name scores of people in movies and television and theater, certainly nowadays, in the wake of The Simpsons. But I became so instantly a campus star and experienced so fully the joy of really stopping the show and just hearing so much applause and getting so much adulation. And Harvard is such a competitive place. I almost relented. It's like, oh, all right, I'll become an actor. And that's a good way to become an actor, almost to be drafted. Because, I had the great luxury of growing up in the business and knowing the hard realities of the business, knowing what I was in for and being prepared for it. Even so, my early years were full of disappointment and rejection and failure. Just it's terribly hard to get going in the business. Again, all in there. So that's the, again, long-winded answer to a short question. Yes?
What did your father think of your movie and TV career?
That's such a good question. You know, who knows? He was a circumspect man when it came to his children. Everything he ever said, every signal I ever got from him was nothing but pride and happiness. He was a man with very, very high standards, almost impossibly high standards. He was kind of an integrity queen. Everything had to be, you know, to him, you know, he didn't consider himself superior as a result of that. That was just his passion and his enthusiasm. He so loved Shakespeare and the classics. And it's, you know, doing movies was never sort of in his field of vision, nor in mine. I mean, when I first started out, I wanted to do just what he did, work in repertory theater. And my greatest ambition was to be a theater manager, actor manager like him. So I never heard him express any contempt. In fact, late in his life, he used to talk occasionally about little moments that he particularly remembered from Third Rock from the Sun. You know, and I would think, wow, I didn't even know you were watching. It was an interesting moment that I was on a, look at this, they've completely sealed off the room. Who knew? They did a sort of half-hour biography program on me on the A&E, and they managed to interview both my mom and my dad. I sort of arranged it. He was in his late 80s by then. And watching this program on television, I saw my father describe me in the opening scene, the very opening moments of M. Butterfly, where I simply sat on stage and looked at the audience, smoking a cigarette before I started speaking. You know, and he described that as a fantastic piece of acting. And I thought, whoa, I didn't know you thought that, you know. So he was such a lovely man, but he was not you know, he wasn't very, very emotionally expressive that way. Perhaps almost as a sort of matter of policy. Who knows? Anything else? Yes.
Now that you've done some writing, what is your preference for
How I spend my time?
theater, film?
Oh, well, you know, I love variety. I work in many, many areas, which is the fun thing about my career. I think my favorite thing to do is have a really great role in a really great new play. And that's exactly what I have coming up in the spring. I'm going to do a new play in New York by David Auburn, who wrote Proof. It's only his second play on Broadway, and I'm very, very excited about that. I don't think there's anything that gets you quite so keyed up. But, you know, if I had any rule at all, it's that everything you do should be as different as possible from the last thing you did, just to keep it interesting. And that goes for, you know, leaping from movies to TV to stage, but even leaping elsewhere, too. I entertain little children, give concerts for them with this fabulous jazz septet, like old vaudeville and novelty songs, or with full orchestras, or I write children's books, or do CDs for kids. And I haven't completely abandoned my old art ambitions, although it really doesn't, it's no more than a hobby now, but I still do paint in oils and have a great time doing that. And I would say the most important thing is to sort of shore things up with my family, spend time with my wife. I mean, I'm all over the place, on location, on tour, on a book tour, and it's a very public life. I'm out there all the time. And to sort of counterbalance that every chance I get, we have a very sort of exclusive marriage. We just spend as much time as we possibly can alone together. Yes?
What roles have you been offered but turned down? And what roles have you wanted but didn't get?
Well, there have been a few stupid mistakes. I'll only tell you about one of them. Mainly, I don't tell people because out of respect for the actor who ended up doing it, and out of pure sour grapes, you know, it's like bloody-mindedness. He went and had all this glory that I could have had, you know. One of the last chapters in my book is called "My Biggest Mistake," and I address exactly that issue. It's so if you have the great luxury of choices as an actor, you know, it's churlish to complain about making the wrong choice between 2 roles, let alone 3 or 4, when most actors don't even have one. But you do live with this constant anxiety: have I made the wrong choice? And this constant fear that you'll turn something down that some other actor will have a huge success with. And that's happened a few times. The one I write about is I turned down the American premiere of Pinter's Betrayal on Broadway. And I did, instead I chose to do a friend's new play for Joe Papp downtown. We'd done a reading of it, and everybody had thought it was so wonderful. And the playwright was a friend, and Joe Papp was an impossible man to say no to. He just brutalized you until you finally said yes, and ridiculed your other choices. So I turned down Betrayal and did this play for Joe, which was a complete failure. It was dismissed in the press. It ran for about 2.5 weeks. Joe was there for about 1/2 of the dress rehearsal and then was never heard of again. And Betrayal was a year-long, sold-out hit on Broadway. Just amazing. And it opened, like, after we had been open for about 5 days, Betrayal opened. It was like, oh, great. It was agony. But because it closed, I was out of work. I was available. I got another job, which was not a great job, but it rehearsed for 3 weeks in Los Angeles before shooting for a week in Dallas, Texas. And during those 3 weeks in LA, I met my wife. You know, we've been married 30 years, have 2 kids, and none of that would have happened if I hadn't made the biggest mistake of my professional career. And that's virtually the moral of the entire book. The last line of that chapter is, acting is pretty great, but it isn't everything. And I always remind myself of that when I think I've made a foolish mistake. I mean, God is just flipping coins 100 times a day. I'm sure every single one of you has a story like that. Another question? Yes?
You said earlier that your life experience has perhaps been more important to your acting, but I'm curious about your more theatrical training.
Mm-hmm.
If there's anything that's been really valuable to you throughout your career.
I feel like I'm just so experienced by now. That I've just done so many different things, and there's no replacement for that. You know, young actors whom I talk to, they so want, they can't help it. They want to be movie stars. You know, and that's a perfectly legitimate ambition. But I say to all of them, do theater. Just do as much theater as you can for as long as you can, because on stage is where you really discover who you are as an actor. You discover what your strengths are, and you discover what your weaknesses are, which is even more important. And you're doing it in front of small audiences. You're not doing it in front of the entire world. You know, and you're not sort of experimenting, you know, on-the-job training in front of millions and millions of people. You're figuring out, your audiences are telling you what you're good at. And that, and I must say, I also had 2 fantastic years in London, having this British classical training, even though I was a fairly experienced classical actor. The only downside of that was I came home with an English accent that I I didn't even know I had. My sister refused to talk to me unless I dropped that awful accent. And I said, "What accent?" You know, so. Another question? Does that answer your question? Yes?
First, thank you, John, for everything and your wonderful work. Just want to add, one of my favorite movies that you were part of, that I like to side note, is All That Jazz.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to see what was it like working with Bob Fosse.
Read the book. I have a whole section on Bob. Would you like me to read it? Tell me how much time we have. I don't want to keep you guys.
We're towards the end, so.
You know, why don't I just read you that section? Because it's fabulous. I mean, Bobby was so fabulous. And that's better than just talking. Reading's better than talking. God, I was never good with props. Let's see now. Yeah, it's fairly close to the end. I have a long section on Broadway theater in which I sort of list, I try to condense all of the 12 Broadway shows I did in the 1970s with a kind of scorecard. 6 Brits, 5 premieres, 3 comedies, etc. There is a number missing from my 1970s Broadway scorecard. That number is 0. 0 musicals. I performed in not a single production of a Broadway musical in that entire decade. In fact, I learned early on that the worlds of legit and musical theater on Broadway are virtually 2 separate professions. The people from those 2 different worlds rarely even know each other. I'd done lots of light opera in my college days and a few musicals in summer stock, but my singing and dancing skills had little to recommend them besides their slap-happy enthusiasm. I couldn't possibly measure up to the hundreds of amazingly talented song and dance performers who fiercely competed every day for the minuscule number of musical theater jobs in and out of town. But to my amazement, the undisputed king of Broadway director-choreographers took an interest in me. Bob Fosse always loved to get his thoroughbred singer-dancers to act. In my case, he seemed intent on getting an actor to sing and dance. When he was casting the new Kander and Ebb musical, Chicago, he called me in to audition. He had me in mind for the role of Amos, the hapless cuckold, best remembered for his melancholy song, Mr. Cellophane. Through my agent, I was told to learn Bert Williams' classic ballad, Nobody, and to come in and sing it for Bob Fosse. I worked my head off with a coach, came to my audition, and sang my heart out for Bobby. Bob Fosse was a small man. He was pale, wiry, and balding, with the fidgety fixity of a mongoose. He wore a signature uniform of black jeans, black dance shoes, and a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up above his elbows. He appeared to have a half-smoked cigarette permanently affixed to the corner of his mouth. Curiously, for an ex-dancer, his posture was not great. Although he was always grimly focused on the job at hand, his gray eyes twinkled with mischief, and he loved everything about show business. My audition seemed to charge him with excitement. After my song, he had me read a speech for the lead role of Billy Flynn, the razzle-dazzle trial lawyer. He brought me back 2 more times in the coming weeks, shifting me back and forth between Billy and Amos, 2 vastly different characters. I was not really right for either role, but Bob seemed restless and frustrated that he couldn't squeeze me into either one. Soon afterwards, Jerry Orbach was aptly cast as Billy Flynn and Barney Martin as Amos. I was neither surprised nor disappointed. I'd gotten a lot further than I'd expected. I'd had 2 callbacks for a big Broadway musical, and I'd had my Bob Fosse moment. That was enough for me. But as it turned out, all those auditions ended up landing me a Bob Fosse job after all. 4 years later, Bob was halfway through the murderously difficult shooting period for his autobiographical film, All That Jazz. The film was loosely based on the creation of Chicago all those years before. In the movie, Roy Scheider plays a character that unmistakably represents Bob himself. During the rehearsals for Chicago, Bob had suffered a massive heart attack that stopped production for a period of months. An identical episode is the central crisis of All That Jazz. In the script of the film, when production is suspended, the producers go to a rival director to take over the show. For this role, Bob had cast an actual director, filmmaker Sidney Lumet. Bet you didn't know that. When the film's shooting schedule ran over, Lumet was forced to pull out for another project. Bob had to find a replacement fast. He thought of me. He called up and asked me to play the part, as if he were politely asking me for a favor. I couldn't say yes fast enough. And so it was that in 1978, I finally crossed the line that separated legit and musical theater in New York. Ironically enough, I did it in a movie. My role was actually featured in only 2 dialogue scenes, tart but brief. As the rival director in the script, I was clearly the embodiment of all of Bob's Broadway nemeses, Hal Prince, Michael Bennett, Gower Champion, et al. He directed the scenes with relaxed, sardonic humor and with the offhand precision of a choreographic taskmaster. My cynical little role was acid fun, but the real joy of doing All That Jazz lay elsewhere. I appeared in a huge production number that came at the very end of the film. I was nothing more than a glorified extra in the sequence, one of a dozen minor characters from the film who sit in the audience of a hallucinatory rock concert. The concert features Roy Scheider and Ben Vereen belting out "Bye Bye Life" to herald the death of Scheider's character. For 9 days of shooting, I saw Bob Fosse indefatigably at work. I saw Ben Vereen, Ann Reinking, and Kathy Dobie hurl themselves into his athletic choreography, duplicating every move and gesture through at least 50 angles and at least 300 takes. I never saw a trace of nerves, fatigue, or bad humor from any of them. There was just strength, concentration, commitment, and talent. In those 9 days, the musical gang put the legit gang to shame. 20 years later, in 2002, I did my first Broadway musical. 3 years after that, I did my second. Taken together, I played about 600 performances. I never missed a single show. I was nominated for 2 Tony Awards for Best Actor in a Musical. I even won one of them. But I had watched Bob Fosse direct his thoroughbreds through 9 days of shooting on All That Jazz. In 600 shows, I never quite got over the nagging feeling that as a song and dance man in the Broadway musical theater, I was a total fraud. And I think that should probably wrap us up. But that's Bob Fosse. Thank you. And I'm signing books if anybody's buying. Bobby and Mike Nichols and Jose Quintero, Meryl Streep. There's loads and loads of people who get their little thumbprint portrait in the book, but the big character is me. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to talk.